McQuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McQuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
You know, either the United States won the Cold War with Russia, or, as former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright says, Russia lost it. The fact remains that relations between Russia and the U.S. have heated up. Co-hosting this program with me is Jim Falk, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, who recently interviewed some key experts on these issues. And Jim, what are the stakes that we're looking at foreign policy right now?
Well, this is certainly a key time with relations between the United States and Russia. And in fact, with the Mueller report just being released, it appears to really exonerate President Trump. So I think one of the questions we'll want to address today, does this open up a new pathway?
Well, our guest joining us, David Walaloo, is geopolitical consultant, award-winning educator, former D.C. international security analyst, and founder of Global Perspective Consulting. His latest book is Beneath the Veil, The Fall of the House of Saud, and his forthcoming book, which we're looking forward to, David, The Russian Roulette, Russia's Infiltration of American Society. We're excited about that, so thank you for coming to the program.
My pleasure.
And sitting next to you is Robert Donaldson. He's Trustees Professor of Political Science. He's emeritus at the University of Tulsa, where he served as president from 1990 to 1996. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the author or co-author of 6 books, including his latest, which you'll see, and it's laying here on the table, The Foreign Policy of Russia, Changing Systems, Enduring Interest. Bob, welcome to the program.
Delighted to be here.
Thank you. And Jim, you interviewed a couple of people. Talk to us about who they were, and let's hear from one of them right now.
Well, I did, Dennis. And in fact, the first program at the World Affairs Council this year was with Ambassador McFaul, who had been ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014, and is the author of another book, From Cold War to Hot Peace, an American ambassador in Putin's Russia. And I asked him, how was it that Boris Yeltsin selected Vladimir Putin, really out of obscurity? So let's hear what he has to say.
Good.
Why did Boris Yeltsin elevate Putin to prime minister rather than pick someone from the political class? Also, did he really understand what he was getting?
Great question, and I don't know the answer to your second part, right? Mm-hmm. But Putin's a completely accidental president, to your point. I actually met him in the spring of 1991. I've known Putin for a long time. Not sure we're Facebook friends anymore. Maybe we are, given what goes on Facebook. But I met him when he was the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. Mm-hmm. He worked for a very charismatic figure, Anatoly Sobchak was his name. But he was just a bureaucrat. He was in charge of international affairs, and I was there with an American NGO doing democracy work, by the way, at the invitation of Sobchak.
Which he remembers.
Which he does remember. He remembers well. Yeah. But we were there at the invitation of his boss. But I tell you that story because he was always around the political class. He was never a political leader. And when Sobchak lost an election, by the way, that doesn't happen very often in these days, but Putin was without a job, and he approached his friends working for Yeltsin in Moscow. And that's how he showed up in Moscow and worked as kind of mid-level bureaucrat in the Kremlin. He doesn't want people to remember that, right? He wants to say there was the Yeltsin era, which was horrible, and then I came and saved Russia. But he, for several years, worked for Boris Yeltsin. But he was not the heir apparent, to your question. There's another guy, Boris Nemtsov was his name. Yeltsin had picked him to succeed him. He was a mayor in a town called Nizhny Novgorod, had been elected twice, was a charismatic, Western-leaning guy. He was a good friend of mine before being assassinated in 2015. Everybody knew that was the plan. So Nemtsov came from Nizhny Novgorod, became the first deputy prime minister, and was being cultivated. And then 1998, there was a financial crash, you may remember, because it wasn't just in Russia. It was all over the world. It didn't start in Russia, but it had giant economic negative consequences in Russia. And the government was forced to resign as a result of that. And Yeltsin couldn't get a liberal candidate through the parliament. And that's when he chose Putin, and he became a prime minister. Not approval rating, his recognition rating at the time he became prime minister was 5%.
Amazing.
95% didn't know who he was. And then he chose him, I think, out of stability reasons, but I think the consequences were not what Yeltsin intended.
And Bob, when that happened, we never thought, I suppose, that Vladimir Putin would be in power as long as he has been, and I'm not sure when the end of his reign may be, but at one point there really was this reset, and it appeared that U.S. and Russia relations would be much more favorable than they are now. What happened?
Well, what happened is that Putin estimated that some kind of partnership originally. He even tried a partnership in 2001 with President George W. Bush. But he estimated that that would bring Russia back to the table as a respected great power, and that the United States and Russia could accomplish some things that they had in common, in interests in common, but also that some of Russia's concerns would be addressed. And when they weren't, and when the U.S. went on to invade Iraq and make further expansion of NATO, Putin was alienated. Obama tried to overcome that with the reset. Michael McFaul certainly played a large role in that. So you're saying somewhat we're responsible for some of these issues?
I absolutely do believe that, and I think that it's wrong, in my opinion, to characterize Putin as anti-Western and Yeltsin somehow as very different. I think both of them had as their paramount interest restoring Russia as a great power.
Yep. And David, you have a response to that, I'm sure?
Well, certainly, I'll concur with Bob regarding his assertion, because there is this thinking in Washington, this establishment, that we're going to have to identify the enemy, the Russians. Now, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the dynamics have changed on the global stage. You know, foreign policy realism has always been some sort of between the diagnosis and prescription of how nation-states behave in a chaotic international system. But at the same time, they're going to have to think in terms of how they formulate policy. And Russia falls within that, because we didn't keep our promises when the Soviet Union ended.
And specifically,
specifically with that, for example, we said that we are not going to move an inch eastward. This is the quote of President Bush, and yet we expanded west. Russia didn't interpret that as, Russia never thought of America as a partner. But when we embarked on enlarging NATO eastward, they're going to have to think in terms of, we can't partner with the Americans.
And the reunification of Germany played a big role as well.
Which it did indeed, because the thinking was, well, we're going to reunify based on what Gorbachev said, that we're going to assist with the free trade, we're going to assist with the economy. We have not done that. And the Russians look at like, why the Americans are going back on their words? And yet, they embarked on us, for example, support the UN Security Council resolution as far as even Libya, Iraq, even for the counterterrorism in Afghanistan. But all of a sudden, we took a different path. Again. And that's where the Russian tensions come from.
Yeah, and Bob, we talk about these relations. A lot of these relations with Russia have been with treaties of different kinds. Give us some sense of the history of treaties and bring us on up to kind of where we are today with the treaty issue.
Well, the treaties really, I think, began in the Nixon era in the period of détente, but they continued with Ronald Reagan. And there were important arms control agreements that were made. There were, in the Nixon period, there were more understandings about how in that very tense time of nuclear confrontation, the two sides should behave. But those understandings and those treaties really didn't survive the Cold War. Well, the treaties did, but now, of course, they are being disavowed. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty just President Trump said that the U.S. is going to withdraw within 6 months, and Mr. Putin said the Russians will do that too. But also the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, the START Treaty, which was a reduction of strategic arms, it will expire. It was negotiated by George W. Bush and Putin, and that is going to expire. Originally, this first START, and then the Obama administration extended it, and now it'll expire in 2021 unless there is an effort, and I think there really should be, to keep it in place, because these treaties have really had a major role in governing the strategic relationship and